It was an ordinary morning in the city, the kind of day where the sun seemed to hang just long enough in the sky to make everyone feel like there was something more to look forward to, but the streets were still bustling with their usual energy. As Judge Andrew Harris stepped into the courtroom, he felt his usual sense of authority settle over him like a well-worn coat. The walls of the courtroom held a cool silence. As he walked to his bench and sat down, he adjusted his glasses and looked over the case files before him, his eyes scanning the pages as his mind went over the details of the traffic violation before him. The case was straightforward. A woman named Dr. Camille Thomas had been cited for speeding through a school zone, but there was something about her name that seemed unfamiliar to him. As he glanced at the file and then looked up at the woman standing before him, she was calm, composed, and dressed in a dark gray suit that spoke of professionalism without being overly flashy. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her posture was upright like someone who had faced far more difficult challenges than a simple traffic ticket. Camille stepped forward with a respectful nod. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, "and even I was unaware of the speed limit in that area, and I was rushing to an urgent meeting. I truly apologize for the inconvenience, and I understand the seriousness of the violation. I would appreciate any leniency you can offer." Judge Harris nodded but didn't look up immediately. As he turned to the file in front of him again, he felt a sense of certainty build in him. As he reviewed her explanation, despite her calm demeanor, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was like so many others who believed they could talk their way out of consequences. He'd seen it countless times before, people coming into his courtroom expecting sympathy because they were too busy or too important for the rules to apply to them. Camille's tone was polite, but Harris could already tell she wasn't going to play into the usual drama of courtroom theatrics he'd grown accustomed to. He looked back at her now and met her eyes for the first time since she had entered the room. There was nothing about her expression that suggested weakness or fear. Instead, she held his gaze with a quiet strength that was almost unnerving to him. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't begging for mercy, and that unsettled him even more so when she simply stood there waiting for his judgment. He felt a quick flicker of annoyance flash across his mind, but he quickly masked it with his practiced professionalism. "Camille Thomas," he said slowly, "I'm afraid your explanation doesn't change the facts of the case. You were speeding through a school zone. Regardless of the circumstances, the rules are the rules." He reached for the gavel, feeling a sense of finality as he delivered his decision. "A fine of $500, he said firmly, and turned his attention to the next case without giving her a second thought. Camille stood still for a moment, taking in the words. The fine wasn't the problem, it was the way he had dismissed her without hearing her fully, the way he had already made up his mind. Before she even spoke, it wasn't just about the ticket, it was about being judged without being seen, but she didn't let it show. She simply nodded respectfully and turned to leave the courtroom, but something in the air seemed to change as she walked out into the hall. As Camille stepped out of the courtroom, the cool air of the hallway greeted her, but it did little to ease the rising tide of frustration within her. She had faced judges like Harris before, people who believed that their position of power made them infallible. It wasn't the fine that bothered her, though it was far steeper than she expected. It was the way he had dismissed her so quickly, as though she didn't deserve to be heard, as if her words and her reason were irrelevant. She had known the moment she entered the courtroom that she would be treated with indifference, maybe even hostility. Her race had already set her apart in his eyes, and her gender was just another layer of prejudice that had built up over time. She sighed deeply, trying to calm herself. She had learned to let moments like this slide off her shoulders. Camille had spent years developing a thick skin, not just in the courtroom, but in life. She had climbed to the top of the legal field, becoming the first Black woman to serve as the dean of one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Her accomplishments were undeniable, and yet, every day she still faced the subtle weight of assumptions, of being underestimated. But that's what had driven her, what had fueled her to keep pushing forward, even when others tried to hold her back. Camille walked down the hall and toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She didn't look back. What had just transpired was typical, but she wouldn't let it define her. She was used to these moments, and as uncomfortable as they were, they only made her more determined to continue her work, to show others that a person's worth wasn't determined by their skin color or gender. It wasn't about proving herself to people like Judge Harris, but about showing up for the students, for the future lawyers who would one day shape the legal system. The walk back to her office at the law school was quiet, the autumn breeze brushing against her as she thought about the day ahead. Camille had been invited to speak at a faculty meeting that afternoon, an engagement she had been preparing for over the past few weeks. She hoped it would be a more productive environment, one where intellect and merit would shine through rather than outdated biases. She arrived at the law school building, her mind shifting gears as she entered the familiar space of the academic world. The halls were filled with the low murmur of students and faculty, the buzz of thought-provoking conversation hanging in the air. It was here that she thrived, where her ideas mattered, where she could make real change. She felt a brief flicker of satisfaction at the thought, knowing that while some people still held on to old prejudices, this was a place where she had carved out her space through hard work and determination. Inside the faculty lounge, the room grew quieter as the professors and staff took their seats. Camille entered with the grace that had earned her respect in this very room. She greeted her colleagues, nodding at familiar faces, but it wasn't until she reached the front of the room that she noticed something unusual. A guest was already there, standing by the podium. It wasn't uncommon for the school to invite prominent members of the legal community, but this particular guest caught her off guard. It was Judge Andrew Harris. The recognition hit her like a bolt of lightning. There he was, standing in the very place where, years ago, he had sat as a law student. And now, here he was, about to give a lecture to the same faculty who had been instrumental in shaping his career. It wasn't just that he was here. It was that she had just seen him in court just hours before, passing judgment on her with such certainty, not realizing who she truly was. As Camille entered the faculty lounge, she could feel the eyes of the room on her, the subtle shift in energy as her presence settled over the group. She was used to it. After all, as the dean of the law school, she commanded respect, but today the atmosphere felt different. There, standing by the podium, was Judge Andrew Harris. His back was to her as he conversed with a colleague, but the familiarity of his posture, the way he carried himself, was unmistakable. Camille's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected to see him here, certainly not so soon after their encounter in court. For a moment, she considered turning back. She could leave, avoid the awkwardness, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She had worked too hard to build her career, to let her achievements be overshadowed by the prejudices of others. No, she would confront this head-on. Besides, this wasn't just about him. This was about her students, her colleagues, and her mission to change the legal system for the better. Camille took a steadying breath and walked toward the front of the room, where the staff had already begun to settle into their seats. The soft chatter that had filled the space moments before faded to a respectful silence as she made her way to the podium. Judge Harris turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, his eyes locked with hers, and she could see the flicker of recognition flash across his face. She didn't react. Instead, she nodded politely, her gaze unwavering, before stepping up to the front of the room. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I trust you've all had a productive day so far." There was a momentary pause, a slight tension in the air. The faculty members exchanged looks, clearly sensing the unusual dynamics between Camille and the judge. Harris seemed to collect himself quickly, offering a brief smile before returning to his usual stern composure. "Dean Thomas," he said with a nod, his voice warm but distant, "it's a pleasure to be here." Camille didn't miss the subtle hint of discomfort in his tone. He was the guest here, the one who had been invited to speak, and yet his demeanor now seemed off, almost as if he were trying too hard to act at ease. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She needed to focus on the lecture at hand. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Judge Harris delivered his talk on racial bias in the courtroom, a subject that, ironically, seemed to weigh heavily on him now. He spoke of how the justice system was supposed to be impartial, how judges were meant to rise above personal biases. His words were measured, professional, but Camille couldn't help but notice the underlying tension in his delivery. The points he made about fairness seemed almost too self-conscious, as if he were trying to convince not just the room, but himself as well. And then he said it, a phrase that caught Camille off guard. Every day, we face decisions that reflect who we are as individuals. Harris continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. But we must remember that our personal judgments should never cloud the impartiality of the law. Camille's heart skipped a beat. Was he aware? Did he know how his personal biases had affected her case earlier that day? Was this an attempt to redeem himself, or was it just a coincidence? As he finished speaking, the room erupted into polite applause. Camille remained still, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure if she felt anger, disappointment, or something else entirely. But what she did know was that their paths had crossed again, and this time, it wouldn't be by accident. The faculty meeting wound down as Judge Harris stepped away from the podium, his lecture complete. The polite applause echoed in the room, but the mood had shifted. Camille could feel it in the air, a tension that was impossible to ignore. Faculty members exchanged hushed whispers, some of them clearly impressed by his words, while others seemed to sense the subtle discomfort that lingered between the two of them. Camille remained composed, her face an unreadable mask, but her mind was racing. She had never expected to find herself in this situation, standing in the same room with the judge who had just imposed a harsh fine on her only hours earlier. As the meeting concluded, faculty members began to gather in small groups, discussing the lecture and its implications. Camille, however, had other things on her mind. She wasn't sure what had compelled her to approach him now, but she knew she had to confront him. It wasn't about the fine. It wasn't about the money or the legal technicalities. It was about the way he had treated her. Dismissive, condescending, as though she was just another defendant in his courtroom to be easily dismissed without understanding. She walked across the room with purposeful steps, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. As she approached Judge Harris, she could see him speaking with one of the professors, though he seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally darting toward her. When he finally noticed her approaching, he straightened, his posture suddenly more rigid. "Dean Thomas," he said, offering a polite but somewhat strained smile. "I didn't expect to see you here today. It's good to have you join us." Camille nodded, not returning the smile. "Judge Harris," she said, her voice steady but laced with an underlying tension. "I'd like to have a word with you, if you don't mind." He hesitated for a split second, clearly sensing the gravity of her tone. "Of course," he replied, motioning toward a quieter corner of the room. "Let's talk." They moved away from the others, and the low hum of conversation seemed to fade as they were left alone. Camille took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. This was not going to be easy, but it needed to be done. "You know," Camille began, her voice calm but pointed, "it's interesting that we find ourselves here today. Just this morning, I was standing in your courtroom." Harris blinked, clearly caught off guard. I'm sorry. I didn't realize," he stammered. "I didn't know who you were when you came in." Camille raised an eyebrow. "No, you didn't. And frankly, I'm not sure that would have mattered. You saw a black woman standing before you, and you made assumptions based on that alone. You didn't even give me the chance to explain myself before deciding my fate." There was a moment of silence as Harris processed her words. He seemed genuinely shocked, his face paling slightly. He began but stopped himself, clearly unsure how to respond. "I didn't mean to." Camille held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not asking you to justify your actions. I'm asking you to acknowledge them. You passed judgment on me without fully hearing me, based on who you thought I was, not who I actually am. That's the problem." Harris opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again, his eyes flicking to the floor. For the first time since they had met, he appeared truly vulnerable, like a man grappling with the consequences of his own behavior. He started again, his voice quieter now. "I didn't realize." Camille exhaled slowly, watching his reaction carefully. She had no interest in tearing him down, but this moment, this conversation, was important. It was about confronting the system that allowed people like him to continue with their biases unchecked. "The thing is," Camille continued, her tone softening slightly, "it's not just about what happened today. It's about all the people who are affected by that same kind of thinking every single day. It's about the lives that are impacted when the system is weighed down by prejudices we don't even realize we're carrying. Harris stood in silence for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor as if searching for the right words. When he finally looked up, there was a new expression on his face, a mixture of guilt and realization. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with sincerity. "I truly didn't understand. I see that now, and I'm sorry for how I treated you in court." Camille nodded, her expression neutral. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. You need to take action. You need to understand why it happened and how to prevent it from happening again. It's not just about me. It's about all the people you come into contact with in your work. You need to do better." The silence that followed Camille's words seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Judge Harris stood there, looking as if he had been struck by a revelation that was both uncomfortable and unavoidable. He ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in thought. Camille could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to process the weight of what she had just said. The air between them was thick with unspoken truths, but Camille didn't break the silence. She wasn't here to hold his hand or offer comfort. She was here to make him understand that his actions had consequences, not just for her, but for the many others who might never get the chance to speak up. "You're right," Harris finally said, his voice quieter now, carrying an undertone of regret. "I didn't realize the extent of my own biases. I've always prided myself on being fair, on following the law without letting personal opinions get in the way. But I can see now that I was wrong." Camille raised an eyebrow. She wasn't sure if she believed him yet. After all, it was easy to say the right things when your actions had already caused harm. But this was a moment of reflection, and Camille wasn't about to close the door on this conversation too quickly. He had made a mistake, and it wasn't up to her to let him off the hook. But there was something in his demeanor now, something different from the arrogant certainty he had shown earlier in the courtroom. She could see that he was beginning to confront the reality of his actions, and that alone was a step in the right direction. "I've heard people say that a judge's job is just to apply the law," Harris continued, his voice steady, though still tinged with uncertainty. "But you're right. It's about more than that. It's about the people behind the case, and in my rush to enforce the law, I forgot that." Camille didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a moment to let his words sink in. This was a rare thing, a judge admitting his fault. And as much as she didn't want to let him off easy, there was a part of her that couldn't help but appreciate the rarity of the moment. She wasn't looking for perfection. She was looking for accountability. "I've worked in this system long enough to know that it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to," Camille said finally. "And the more I learn, the more I realize that it's not just the laws that are broken, it's the people who enforce them. We've all been conditioned to believe certain things, to make assumptions whether we realize it or not. That's what I'm fighting against, not just in the courtroom, but in the system as a whole." Harris nodded slowly, as though weighing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about that since we spoke this morning," he admitted. "It's unsettling to realize how deep those biases run, how they can cloud even the most rational decisions." Camille met his gaze, her eyes sharp and focused. Unsettling is an understatement, but it's not enough to just recognize it. You need to actively work to change a judge. Every time you step into that courtroom, you need to ask yourself, am I seeing this person as a case or as a human being? That's where the real change begins. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the quiet hum of voices from the adjacent rooms barely reaching them. Harris took another step toward her, his expression serious. "I don't know if I'm ready to change everything," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own reflection. "But I want to try. I want to understand how I can do better, how I can be better. I don't want to be the kind of judge who ignores the humanity of the people I'm supposed to serve." Camille studied him carefully. There was a vulnerability in his voice now, something that hadn't been there when she had first encountered him in court. She didn't expect miracles, and she didn't expect him to immediately transform into the perfect advocate for justice. But this was something. It was progress. It was a start. "Then you're on the right path," she said, her tone measured. "But it's going to take time. And it's going to take a lot more than a simple apology. It's about changing the way you approach every case, every person. It's about making sure that your judgments aren't shaped by anything but the truth. Harris looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. For the first time since they had met, he seemed to be seeing her, not as a case, not as a stereotype, but as a person. Camille gave him a small nod, then turned to walk away, knowing that whatever came next, this moment would linger. The conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a step towards something different. As Camille left the faculty lounge, she could still feel the weight of her conversation with Judge Harris lingering in her mind. It was strange, almost surreal, to have seen him open up in that way, but she wasn't ready to trust it fully. She wasn't interested in hollow promises or quick fixes. Change, true change, was a slow process, something that required action, not just words. The conversation had been important, yes, but it was only the beginning. There was so much more that needed to be done, and Camille knew she couldn't afford to be complacent. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and discussions at the law school, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the moment she had shared with Harris. She found herself wondering what kind of man he was beneath the robes, beneath the title. Was he truly capable of changing the way he viewed the world? Or was this just an isolated moment of self-awareness that would fade with time? Camille didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let him off the hook. If he wanted to prove that he was committed to real change, she would be watching closely. The following week brought with it more challenges. The usual whirlwind of administrative tasks and faculty concerns occupied her time, but Camille made a mental note to keep an eye on Harris. She hadn't forgotten about their encounter, and she knew that change wouldn't come without its setbacks. She found herself wondering if he would actually take the steps to address his biases, or if this was just a fleeting moment of guilt. Her opportunity to gauge his progress came sooner than expected. One afternoon, a colleague from the law school's clinic called her with an update on a case involving a young black man who had been wrongfully charged. The case had been flagged as one of the many that might be affected by racial bias in the system, and the law school had been offering legal assistance. Camille knew that the case would likely end up in front of Judge Harris. This was the perfect moment to see whether he had taken any of her words to heart. She had no illusions about the difficulty of breaking the patterns of bias that had been ingrained in the system for years, but if Harris was sincere about his desire to do better, this would be his first real test. Camille spent the next few days preparing for the case. She worked closely with the clinic team to ensure that they were ready to present a strong argument, but her mind kept returning to Harris. Would he be fair? Would he acknowledge the possibility that his initial biases had shaped his previous decisions? There were so many unknowns, but one thing was clear. This case would define whether his newfound awareness would translate into meaningful action. On the day of the hearing, Camille sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, observing from a distance. As the proceedings unfolded, she couldn't help but watch Harris closely. He was still the same judge she had seen before, calm, collected, authoritative. But now there was a slight difference. He seemed more engaged, more present in a way that went beyond the surface. His gaze lingered on the defendant in a way that didn't feel dismissive, didn't feel as though he was seeing a stereotype. He listened carefully as the defense attorney made their arguments, nodding thoughtfully as the young man's story was laid out. Camille felt a surge of cautious optimism, but she didn't allow herself to get carried away just yet. It wasn't until the end of the hearing, when Harris rendered his decision, that she truly understood the extent of the change. He ruled in favor of the defendant, citing the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and the clear evidence of bias in the investigation. The decision was fair, just, and most importantly, acknowledged the deeper flaws in the system. As the courtroom emptied out, Camille stood from her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected a ruling like that. It wasn't just the outcome, it was the manner in which Harris had approached the case. There was no arrogance, no sense of superiority in his demeanor. It was as if, for the first time, he had truly seen the humanity of the people who came before him, not just the facts of the case. When he passed her on his way out of the courtroom, Camille met his gaze. This time, there was no need for words. She simply nodded. Harris returned the gesture, his expression more open than it had ever been before. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a step, a real one. As the days passed, Camille couldn't shake the sense of hope that had blossomed within her after Harris's decision in the courtroom. The ruling on the young black man's case had been nothing short of groundbreaking. It wasn't just the outcome, it was the way Harris had conducted himself throughout the proceedings. For the first time, Camille had seen a glimpse of the man who had once been so quick to judge her, now listening, engaging, and applying fairness without the bias that had tainted his past decisions. It was enough to make her wonder whether his transformation was genuine or just a fleeting moment of self-reflection. But as the dust settled from the case, Camille reminded herself not to get ahead of herself. One ruling didn't erase a lifetime of ingrained biases, nor did it instantly transform a system built on centuries of inequality. She knew that real change was messy, complicated, and ongoing. Harris might have made progress, but she couldn't afford to be naive. There was still work to be done, both in the courtroom and in their continued interactions. In the weeks that followed, Camille found herself facing new challenges at the law school. There were always administrative tasks to tackle, faculty meetings to attend, and students to mentor. But she also found herself drawn into discussions with her colleagues about the changes happening in the legal field, particularly around racial justice and systemic bias. As the dean, Camille knew she had a responsibility not only to guide her students, but also to influence the broader legal community. She could no longer afford to just observe from the sidelines. It was time to take action, to make sure that the law school was actively working to combat the biases that had shaped the profession for so long. One afternoon, Camille was invited to speak at a conference on diversity and inclusion in the legal profession. The conference had drawn a range of speakers, from advocates to professors to judges, all discussing the pressing issues surrounding racial bias and inequality in the legal system. Camille had been asked to speak on the importance of mentorship and creating inclusive environments for law students of color. As she stood before the crowd, her heart pounded in her chest. The room was filled with influential figures from across the legal world, many of whom were working tirelessly to bring about change. Camille knew that her words carried weight, but it wasn't the podium or the audience that made her nervous. It was the realization that what she said could shape the future of those who were just beginning their legal journeys. The speech went well. Camille spoke passionately about her vision for a more inclusive, empathetic legal profession. She challenged her colleagues to move beyond just talking about change and to start implementing it in meaningful ways. She shared stories of the challenges her own students faced, the barriers they encountered in a system that too often overlooked them. The response from the audience was overwhelmingly positive, and several people approached her afterward to discuss how they could collaborate to push for broader reforms. But as she made her way out of the conference hall, Camille's thoughts drifted back to Harris. It had been a while since their last conversation, and she couldn't help but wonder whether his newfound awareness would be tested again. The real work, she realized, wasn't just in the speeches or the conferences. It was in the everyday interactions, in the decisions that were made when no one was watching. Camille decided that it was time to follow up with him. She needed to see whether he was truly committed to the work of dismantling his biases, or whether he would return to the old patterns of thinking that had initially shaped their relationship. It wasn't a matter of judgment, it was about accountability. She reached out to Harris, inviting him for coffee to discuss his recent experiences on the bench. It was a casual invitation, but Camille's intentions were clear. She wanted to know if his growth was more than just a momentary lapse of judgment or if it had become a permanent shift in the way he viewed the world. When they met at a small cafe later that week, Harris greeted her with a warm smile, but there was a certain cautiousness in his eyes. Camille could sense that he was aware of what this conversation could mean. He had no illusions about her intentions. "I've been thinking about our last conversation a lot," Harris said as they settled into their seats, his voice earnest. "And I've tried to be more mindful of the decisions I'm making. It's not easy, but I'm committed to making a real change, even if it's small steps." Camille studied him carefully. The words were familiar, but she needed to see if they held weight behind them. "Small steps are important," she said, her voice steady. "But it's also about consistency. You can't change for a moment. You have to change for good. Harris nodded. I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I'm serious about this. Camille sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. Then we'll see. I'm watching, Judge. We all are. Weeks passed since Camille's conversation with Judge Harris over coffee, and she found herself reflecting on their exchange more often than she had anticipated. It was clear that he had taken her words to heart, but the lingering question remained. Would his commitment to change survive the pressures and routines of his life on the bench? Camille knew that real transformation wasn't always immediate or visible, and she couldn't afford to grow impatient. However, she wasn't one to let anyone, even someone as influential as Judge Harris, off the hook. For her, the real measure of his growth would be in his actions, not his promises. The days were filled with the usual grind of administrative tasks, student concerns, and ongoing efforts to push forward diversity and inclusion initiatives at the law school. But as Camille juggled the demands of her role, her thoughts often returned to Harris. What was happening behind the closed doors of the courtroom? Was he still grappling with his biases, or had the weight of his decisions begun to make him question the system he had upheld for so long? Then, one afternoon, Camille received a phone call that would give her the answer she'd been searching for. It was from the legal clinic, a place where students worked closely with real clients on cases that touched on issues of race, justice, and inequality. One of the clinic's clients, a black woman who had been unfairly incarcerated for a minor crime, was about to appear before Judge Harris in a hearing for a new trial. Camille had worked with the clinic to gather all the evidence they could to support her client's case, and she knew that this hearing would be another test of Harris' resolve to apply fairness. The phone call was brief but clear. Dean Thomas, we need you in the courtroom today. We're presenting the case to Judge Harris, and we need your presence. There's a chance he might be swayed, one way or another. Camille's heart raced. This was it. This was the test of Harris's growth. She knew that if Harris ruled against the client, it would be a sign that the changes he had claimed to embrace were more about self-interest than justice. But if he ruled in her favor, it would confirm that he had truly taken her words to heart and was ready to challenge the biases he had once allowed to guide his judgments. When Camille arrived at the courthouse, she was immediately struck by the weight of the moment. The courtroom was packed with observers, students from the law school, social justice advocates, and even members of the media who had caught wind of the high-profile case. There was a palpable tension in the air. Everyone knew what was at stake, and no one wanted to be let down by the outcome. As the case unfolded, Camille couldn't help but notice how Judge Harris carried himself. He was calm, methodical, and most importantly, he seemed to be listening, really listening to both sides. He took the time to question the prosecution, carefully examining the inconsistencies in their case. His questions weren't dismissive or patronizing, as they might have been in the past. Instead, they were thoughtful, probing, and aimed at uncovering the truth. When it was finally time for him to issue his ruling, Camille held her breath. Harris paused for a long moment, glancing at the defendant, a woman who had been wrongfully convicted simply because of the color of her skin. His expression was grave, as though he were fully aware of the weight of the decision he was about to make. He turned his gaze toward the courtroom and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. I find that the defendant has been unjustly treated by the system, he began. The evidence is clear, and there is no justification for the continued prosecution of this case. I'm granting a new trial, and the charges will be dismissed. Camille felt a surge of emotion. It wasn't just the ruling that had moved her. It was the way Harris had arrived at it. His words were measured, but there was a conviction in them that suggested he had truly internalized the lessons she had tried to impart. He wasn't just making a decision based on law, he was making it based on justice. As the courtroom emptied, Camille walked up to Harris, her steps purposeful. This time, there was no need for confrontation. There was no more tension between them. He looked at her with a calm, steady gaze, and she offered him a slight nod. Thank you, she said simply. Harris gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. Thank you, Dean Thomas, for helping me see what I couldn't see before. In that moment, Camille knew that the work wasn't done, that there would be more battles to fight and more systemic flaws to confront. But for the first time, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. Harris wasn't perfect, far from it, but he had shown, in his own way, that change was possible, even for someone who had once been part of the problem. As Campbell walked out of the courthouse, she couldn't help but feel that, together, they had taken a step towards something better, not just for themselves, but for the justice system as a whole.